Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm Josh Nelson with Nelson Elder Care Law and appreciate you joining us for what we think is going to be a great topic today. We want to put a little different spin on it. Unfortunately, it's something that a lot of people are scared by, but I think for us, it's something that we embrace and we can really add a lot of help and value to clients whenever they come in with this problem. A lot of people just don't know what to do whenever we have some cloudiness or what we like to call the fog rolling in. So if I set something down and I walk away from it and I forget, or I walk into a room and I don't remember why I walked in there, does that mean that I have cognitive impairment, dementia? Do I need memory care? What does that mean? Probably nothing. But it could be a sign for something that we want to start thinking about. And whenever we're dealing with a parent or a loved one, especially a spouse, that's going through some of these forgetfulness times, we want to be able to identify, is that something that we should be worried about? Is it something that we're prepared for? Do we have a plan in place in case it is something a little bit more worrisome than what we think to start with? So today we're going to go through 5 different sets of things to think about whenever you're dealing with a loved one, especially a parent or spouse that's going through these kind of problems, or you start to notice things. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, my mom tells me the same story over and over. Does that mean she has dementia? Probably not. It probably just means she's lonely, and you should just act surprised to hear her story every time because she's trying to share her life with you. But if it starts to get a little bit more challenging, where you think that maybe the pills aren't getting taken the right way, or we're leaving the oven on, or something's really becoming a safety risk, then at that point the problem is we're probably too far down the road to do some of the steps we're going to talk about today. So, first part of what we're going to talk about is just what we call prepare for the road ahead, making sure that you know what's coming down the pipeline for you. What can we expect? How can we react? What kind of steps can we take now to make sure that going forward in the future, we aren't getting hit by the curveballs of life? Then, as we start going further down that path, and we start seeing more stuff that's forgetfulness or even some frustration, maybe people are going out for a walk and getting lost, or maybe we're forgetting names of people, then we're going to have to really start talking about how to develop a personal support plan. So, how do we help the person that's having the forgetfulness, but also how do we help the caregiver, so you in this instance, make sure that you're getting what you need, because caregiving really is one of the hardest things you'll ever do in your life. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how communication changes whenever people start to have cognitive impairment. Whenever people get forgetful, a lot of times if we communicate with them the same way we have for the last 60, 70, 80, sometimes even 90 years, it becomes very abrasive to them and they kind of shrink back. And that causes a lot of problems with not only exacerbating some of the symptoms or signs that they have some cognitive issues, as well as it makes it so it's less likely that they're going to reach out for help. So we'll just talk about some keys about what we should talk about, what we shouldn't talk about, just little tweaks in our words that can make a big difference. Then lastly, we're going to start talking about setting some routines, making sure that people have structure and stability. We all know that at any point in our life, whenever we lose structure, whenever we lose that routine, whenever we just don't know what's going to come around the corner, it can be stressful. And unfortunately, whenever people that are suffering from cognitive impairment start to get stressed, it can really show some signs of things that we don't want to go through. And then lastly, as the caregiver, as the person that's signing up to do this amazing thing and provide your loved one with what they need as far as support goes, how do we make sure you're taken care of? One of the worst things that we see is whenever a spouse comes in and unfortunately they've been caring for their spouse at home so hard and so long that it's really damaged their health, not only physically but also mentally as well. It's damaged their relationships. It's made it so that they don't have somewhere to turn to anymore. And a lot of times what we have to refocus people on whenever they come in is that if you're the caregiver, we got to take care of you, because although sometimes there's somebody that might step in after you, they arguably aren't going to do as good a job as you. So we got to make sure that we balance you taking care of yourself so that you continue to care for the one that you love. Going back up to the top there, preparing for the road ahead, the more you learn about cognitive impairment or dementia or Alzheimer's, the more you find out that there are some future challenges that come with it, but also that there's a lot that's still unknown. A lot of times a primary care physician will diagnose somebody with cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's or frontal lobe dementia or vascular dementia or all these different kinds of things that sometimes just aren't accurate. And so whenever you start to see these signs, it's really important that you talk to a specialist. And so, who is that specialist? Generally, for most health insurances, it's going to start with a neurologist. But if you have the opportunity to see a neuropsychologist, that's really where we'd ask for you to start with. They can do some more in depth testing. Some of it's imaging, but a lot of it's just a better cognitive test compared to what's called a MiniMental. So, a MiniMental is often what a primary care physician or even sometimes a neurologist will do. That's really just asking you things like, what day is it? What's this list I'm going to ask you to repeat back to me? Things that a lot of us can be able to do, and it's scaled on a scale that's not really accurate for what most people experience. A lot of people don't realize that with cognitive impairment or whenever we start to get some memory issues, it's not a on-off switch. Sometimes it starts slow, sometimes it starts fast. A lot of times something like a fall or a hospital stay or a reaction to some kind of anesthesia or medicine can trigger it where it's a bigger drop than what we expect. Sometimes it's just you come home for Thanksgiving and you haven't seen mom for a while and you see that she sounds better on the phone than she looks like in real life. Those are all things we want to keep an eye out for. But whenever you go to a neuropsychologist, they're going to do a more in-depth test, ask things that maybe she's not as well equipped to hide. And so a MiniMental is pretty easy for most people to pass, especially if they've already done one at some other point in their life, because they know what questions are coming. If you ask somebody, what's the name of your kids, they usually know that until even the later stages of cognitive impairment. But if you ask somebody a more complex question, like what happens if you got lost? How would you find your way back? Those are more thought indicative questions that can make it so it's harder for somebody that has reasoning problems to be able to explain how that works. The long-term memory of being able to memorize your kids' names or your pets' names, those are pretty easy for most people to maybe hide some of the issues that they're really having. And so we want to make sure that if you have the option that you're getting in front of somebody that can really do some testing there and help you out. But again, like we said earlier, the problem is the more you find out about this stuff, the more you find out we just don't know as much as we would like to think we know about this. Remember that this is really one of the first generations that's going through a lot of this testing, and because it takes years to test for this, and you have to find people before they're showing symptoms to get involved in a lot of those scientific studies, we don't know a lot about cognitive impairment. There are a couple drugs on the market right now that the idea behind them is that they can slow cognitive impairment. And I've actually had a few clients that have been very, very successful with those. The problem that we run into is that because it's a newer drug, because it's a newer protocol, and because there's so many different types of cognitive impairment, sometimes clients act very negatively to those things as well. And so we want to make sure if somebody's taking any kind of new pills, especially if it came from a primary care physician rather than a neuropsychologist, that we're keeping a close eye on them and making sure that they're having a good reaction to it. The other thing that we need to think about whenever we're kind of planning for the road ahead is if something happens where it becomes a faster process than what we hope for. So instead of just going as a slow kind of slope, what happens if we have what we call a plateau drop-off? So we're going at a steady state for a while, and then we have a fall or we have a medical reaction, or something just changes where we get stressed in our life. Sometimes a move can cause this even, where we go from being fine and able to live at home one day to not being okay the next day. If something like that happens, there are some legal things you need to have in place. I think most people going down this care journey have a good idea what those are. It's things like having the legal authority to make financial decisions, healthcare decisions, HIPAA releases in order to be able to just speak with doctors. You want to get these things in place because they're actually pretty inexpensive. Some of the options are even free to get these things done. And if we don't get them done before somebody loses what's called legal capacity, you have to go through this long, drawn-out process called a guardianship and a conservatorship. In a couple weeks, we'll have a topic where we focus just on those, but just so you guys know, it's one of the hardest things for a family to go to. What it does is require an attorney to be appointed for the person. You actually have to go in front of a judge. It's arguing back and forth, and a lot of times, just because people can have good days and bad days, whenever you go to court, they're having a great day, you might not get the decision you want. The other alternative is if they're having a good day and they don't remember that they have bad days, it can really cause strain on your relationships because you'll think that somebody's up there saying things that aren't true. So one of the examples that I have is a client who was making very, very poor financial decisions, actually trying to give away thousands and thousands of dollars to strangers in a parking lot. And there's a police report showing that. But whenever we went to court to go over the case, the man that was doing this didn't have any recollection of this, even though he had a police report, even though everything was very well documented. Because he didn't remember it due to his dementia, it actually made him very upset with his son, thinking that his son was trying to set up all these fake things and steal from him. And that was a big problem. So we want to make sure that you take the steps whenever you first see the signs. And honestly, if you don't see the signs, it's still important really for anybody to have these tools in place so that you don't have to go through that guardianship or conservatorship process. The question that we often get is, what's the difference between a guardianship and a conservatorship? Each state has their own definition, but in Georgia, guardianship is just over what we call the body or the person, essentially medical decisions, and conservatorship is just over the finances or contractual decisions. Depending on your state, especially if you're going to like Tennessee or South Carolina, sometimes they define those terms different than we do down here. The next thing to know is that there is no cure for cognitive impairment. So if you live long enough, it's going to get worse. Cognitive impairment is generally not a fatal diagnosis. It's something where you usually pass of something else many years down the road. But whenever we start talking about those many years, it can be something that requires some care. So if you get to the point where you can't make your own decisions, you can't make your own meals, you get frustrated and try and become what's called a flight risk, which is where maybe you kind of snap to in a different phase of awareness and you get frustrated not knowing where you're at, and you try and leave. A lot of times what we find with this is people, whenever they move their parents in with them to their home, they want to go back to a home that maybe they no longer have, or maybe it was their childhood home, just because they have that kind of disconnection based on their memories of it. In those instances, it's really important for you to sit down with not only your parents, if that's the ones who are caring with, or your spouse, if that's who we're caring for, while they still have some cognitive abilities, to make sure and ask them what they want. The biggest thing that we want to do whenever we're going through caring for anybody is make sure that we're honoring their wishes, and that any way that we can do that, we want to. Often we hear things from families that say, my mom or dad or my spouse never wants to go to an assisted living or a nursing home. That's just not in the cards for them. And I completely understand that sentiment. And if that's the case, we just need to sit down and talk and make sure that you have another support system, whether that be somebody to come inside the home and help out. Maybe it's siblings, maybe it's kids. We just have to figure out what that care plan looks like. Unfortunately, a lot of times whenever people say that they don't want a certain type of care, one of the problems we run into is we haven't defined what care they do want, and if that care option is available or viable. The other big thing is with a society like ours that we have right now, especially down here in Atlanta, it's rare to find people that have lived here their whole lives. A lot of people have moved here from other areas. A lot of people transition because of jobs. And so a big decision, especially as families spread out across the country, is where's your loved one going to live? Usually if it's a spouse, you're going to stay pretty close to where you're at. But especially if we're talking about a parent, are you in a spot where your parents are going to move closer to you? Are they going to move in with you? Are they going to move in with one of your siblings? Do they not want to live where you live? These are all really important things to take into consideration whenever we're making the decision of where do you want to live? Oftentimes, it's usually the oldest adult. Sometimes it's a daughter. Sometimes it's a daughter-in-law. And just because of your caring nature, you end up being kind of forced into this role. And we want to make sure that if that's the case, that we have a true plan there so that you have the support you need. Often one of the biggest issues we run into with families and what we call family dynamics, or just a fancy way of saying fighting, is that siblings will often accuse the caregiver child of not doing it well enough, or not doing it cheap enough, or not doing it as good as it could be done. But often they also aren't willing to step in and do it any different themselves. They just want to critique from the outside. And because of that, that causes a lot of frustration for the caregiver. It causes a lot of frustration for the siblings. So we want to make sure that we have a good plan on that. If there's 5 kids, is it all going to fall on one shoulder? Or is it going to be something where there's a shared responsibility there? If we go into that knowing it, it's really important so that we can set things up from a legal standpoint so that everything goes smooth throughout the process. And that kind of goes into the next step, which is what we have developing a personal support plan. As the caregiver going through the process of trying to figure out what do we need, how do we help things, it's really important to not only focus on what the person that's having the fog roll in needs, but also what that caregiver needs. Usually that person is going to be very hesitant to ask for help. And that goes back to what we talked about before with having the right diagnosis at the beginning. People have strong feelings that if somebody knows that they're impaired or somebody has some memory issues, that they're just going to get locked up in a nursing home or locked up in assisted living. Or, it's a big fear for seniors that haven't toured places to know what they're going to go to. Remember that the assisted livings and the nursing homes from your parents' generation were miles and miles apart from where the ones today are. A lot of times today, there's different types, everything from ones that appear like cruise ships on land, have a bunch of activities and a bunch of hustle and bustle about them, all the way to more reserved, smaller homes that are ranch style. And then there's also an option called a personal care home, which is truly just a home that's been kind of converted into helping somewhere between 4 and 8 people stay there in a very cozy environment. It's really scary for people to tour because they're afraid that if they go on these tours, they're going to get left there. Reassure them that that's not the case. Make sure while we're still at the early stages, whenever we don't have to just take them and pick for them, that they're able to go around and see if something happened where you did need some extra care, what kind of facility would you like to be in? What kind of community do you want to live in? What kind of food do you want? It's a great opportunity for you to get out, meet some of the people, almost all the communities, whenever they aren't under COVID distancing rules, allow you to come in for lunch. They cook you great meals, really kind of wine and dine you, let you see what the opportunity is, as well as meet a couple people that are there just to see what it's like. Just as a kind of side note, whenever you do go on the tours, they're going to have people that come up and meet you, and those people are, of course, great referral sources for the community itself. Also, make a habit out of stopping by a table that maybe the marketer or the salesperson doesn't show you to ask some random people what their thoughts are. But luckily, you're going to find a lot of people that are very vocal, one way or the other, about that community. Remember that the beautiful towers, the granite floors, the gold chandeliers are really something that's an aesthetic view, but whenever you're looking at the actual care they can provide, it's important to talk to the residents to make sure that the staff is really engaged. Whenever you walk through the halls, pay attention to what the staff is doing. Do the staff know people by names? Do the staff know where people are at? These are all important things if you have to help your loved one transition into it. One of the other things is that most people don't just jump into an assisted living or an independent living. They're going to start trying to do some kind of care at home. And usually that's going to be the spouse or the child that's going to help out. And a lot of times we don't really know how to do that well. And so we're blessed here in the Atlanta area to have a couple options for that. First and foremost, if you're not around the area or if you really just have a tight schedule, YouTube is an amazing start. It really is. It can walk you through some things to be able to do different maneuvers and caregiving processes safely so that you can get some best practices. Always be careful of knowing what the source is, but overall, there's some good videos out there. Second, behind that, there's an actual in-home care company called Comforting Arms that offers a caregivers university type setup where you can actually go take some classes in person with them to be able to see how to use things as far as different techniques, different tools, different medical equipment that you might need as a caregiver in order to be able to keep somebody at home as long as possible and as safe as possible. Then behind that, there's always the option to bring actual in-home caregivers in. That's usually where most people start on the care journey. Around the metro Atlanta area, in order to have a company that does that, because they're no longer what's called 1099 contractors, they actually work for that company as W-2 employees, the average rate's going to be somewhere between $23 and $25 an hour. Usually they're going to have somewhere around a 3 to 6 hour minimum in order for them to come out. And so you can see where that adds up pretty quickly. And so again, you want to make a list of what you'd like for that caregiver to do. If they're going to come out for 3 hours, you want to make sure that they're getting everything done in that time frame that you feel is reasonable so that we aren't just wasting somebody's time. We also need to make sure that your loved one is acclimated to that, because if we don't have them doing things, if we don't have them feeling like they're getting a lot of value out of it, the questions about what is this costing, or why is this person in my home, or why are they just sitting around, are always going to come up, and we want to get out in front of those. By joining a support group, you can find some good referrals about who does good caregivers in your area. One of the biggest problems with any caregiver group is staffing. And so you want to make sure that if you're going to a local support group, you're asking people, who do you have that you work with that you like and that shows up consistently and you're not having call outs and things like that with, as well as learning some tips and tricks about local resources in your area. By making use of the available resources that are out there, it can really help the transition. So, the Area Agency on Aging for each county in Georgia has resources available. Unfortunately, depending on your county, those resources vary quite widely. If you're somewhere like Cobb or Fulton or Forsyth, there are great opportunities as you get further north, even up through Cherokee, but definitely up towards like LJ and Gordon County, things like that. You're going to run into a lot less resources than you are in some of the bigger counties. So maybe you have to reach out to the Atlanta Area Agency on Aging. Oh, that's a mouthful. In order to be able to get the resources you need, and you might have to drive down and get some stuff. But for the most part, they're still going to have statewide resources available for you. Sometimes the counties will have a local senior center as well. Those will have some activities and some socialization to help make sure that your parent or loved one is going through and getting that kind of interaction. A lot of times, whenever people have cognitive impairment, one of the first things that they run into is really shrieking back socially just because it's embarrassing for them. Imagine if you're having a conversation and somebody's talking about something, and whenever they're talking about those things, you really have no idea what they're talking about. And then that happens a few times. It starts to make it so that maybe you don't want to interact with those people again just because you're embarrassed by it. And so I want to talk a little bit about communication and how we do those things. Whenever we're communicating with somebody that has cognitive impairment, it's really important to use their name. Make sure that you keep any kind of communication on the shorter side of things. You want to be simple and clear about it. Understand that they might be frustrated. A lot of times, people with cognitive impairment, just because of the age that kind of coincides with it for most people, also have hearing issues. And so we want to make sure they have hearing issues, that we're making a really good effort, that they can understand our mouth, that we're speaking slowly, enunciating our words. We want to use close-ended questions whenever we talk to somebody that has cognitive impairment. So instead of saying something like, "What did you have for lunch?" you can say something like, "Did you enjoy the chicken at lunch?" That way, it's not something that they have to go back in their mind for. Imagine how frustrating it would be to you if somebody asked you something you did just a few minutes ago and you can't recall that. So we want to make sure that going through the process here, we're being as respectful and helping them avoid any kind of frustration. A lot of repetition is helpful so that they keep hearing the same thing over and over. And if you have something such as like body language or even trying to get their attention, make sure that if you're going to touch them, though, that they see it coming. A lot of times people don't realize how intrusive that is if you just put your hand on somebody's knee or shoulder, or especially on their hand, and they aren't expecting it. A couple things that you really want to make sure that you don't ever say whenever you're communicating with somebody with cognitive impairment is things like, "Do you remember?" "Try to remember." "Did you forget?" "How could you not know that?" Those are all things that are going to be very, very frustrating to somebody that truly doesn't remember or get that. Often, whenever you speak in larger paragraphs or you don't have as many pauses between your words, people with cognitive impairment can't keep along with the story depending on what level they're at. And so you want to make sure you speak in shorter sentences, don't drone on forever and ever. And then the last thing that I really want to make sure you do is don't talk in front of the person as if they weren't there. So sometimes whenever somebody can't keep up with the conversation, we just talk about them like they aren't even sitting there in the room. This happens a lot whenever caregivers or spouses go to the doctor or whenever they come in and see a lawyer. We want to make sure that they always feel like they're part of the conversation, that they're always present there. You don't want to use anything that's like patronizing or baby talk to them, but we want to make sure that we're very clear about what we want them to do. Even things like saying, "sit over there," or him or her, or using what we call pronouns, just not defining things clearly. We prefer to say things like, "sit in that blue chair," or "do you remember when Amy came earlier today?" We want to be very specific, not "don't you remember her coming by earlier today?" And this kind of gets into the structure. So, just like we talked about the frustrations of not knowing whenever something has just recently happened, if we do similar things every day or every couple of days, it's important to realize that that can go a long way, especially whenever we still have somebody at home. Sometimes the surprises, sometimes appointments that sneak up on us can really throw somebody into a disorientation that makes it harder for them to be ready. It helps somebody know that they need to have the right hygiene, that they need to be dressed, that they need to have the bedtimes right if we're going to have a big day tomorrow. And unfortunately, with cognitive impairment, it also affects the sleep a lot. And so you kind of get out of your rhythms. And whenever you're out of your rhythms, it causes a lot of health problems as well. So, as much socialization, as much structure as we can get is going to be really helpful in really keeping them at home longer than what normal people can. Sometimes one thing that's really therapeutic, and it's a little hard now as we get hotter in the summer, but getting them outside, even going for a drive, visiting a park, again, we want to be considerate of the heat out there, especially for our seniors. But going for a short little walk, making sure you're with them, getting them outside so that it's just not the same thing over and over can really help. But then lastly, we want to talk about what we call caring for the caregiver. And so we want to take some time and have some reflection and make sure that the person or the spouse, the daughter, the son, whoever is helping the person that has the fog rolling in, is really taking care of themselves. And so we touched on this just for a little bit earlier. Usually, if there's multiple siblings, there's still only one real caregiver. If it's a spouse and that spouse can't do it any longer, whether or not they hurt their back because they try to do a lift improperly, whether or not they've just gotten to the point that they can't drive themselves, if something happens to the primary caregiver, it usually means that both people need care. Often, what happens is people try and avoid getting some extra help or asking for extra help because they don't want to feel what they think is selfish. So, if you're caring for somebody that has a clear illness, sometimes you feel like it's selfish to need a break for yourself because we try and validate that by saying, well, dad needs this, he needs around the clock care. I just can't take the time right now. And you can. You just have to ask for it. You have to be clear whenever you ask for it, because otherwise, some people will dismiss it. The other option is there are paid caregivers, and that's always scary to people because, like we talked about earlier, that can add up really quick. $25 an hour with a 3-hour minimum, it's $75 every time you need that break. But if that $75 is what allows you to be able to take the break you need, get the errands run you need, go have the drink with the girls, just have lunch with somebody and kind of talk about normal adult life, that can be something that keeps you as a caregiver role and allows for your patient or your loved one, your spouse, to be able to stay at home many, many months or years longer than what happens if you get burnt out. Unfortunately, we've helped so many people through this process that we have run into kids that just can't do it anymore. They try to do certain things, they didn't ask for help, and by the time it got down to it, it was just more than they can handle. A lot of times, there's some stages of cognitive impairment that patients go through that are really, really hard to care for. One of the hardest is whenever your spouse or your parent forgets who you are. They call you by the wrong name. They think you're a sister. They think you're a grandchild. They think that you're a mom. Those are very, very emotionally tough things that you need to plan for, but also plan to have a break in there. Make sure that you're not having to be on 24/7, because if something happens where you can't be, then all of a sudden we have a big problem. It means that that person not only is probably not staying at home anymore, but they're probably going straight to a high care community. And that can be the difference where we save $75, but now we're paying $6,000 a month for an assisted living. So we want to make sure we balance those out. I know it's hard. If you work with a good financial advisor or you get a plan with an attorney, they can walk you through some of those hiccups so that you know that they're coming and you don't have to worry about those kind of hitting you at the curveball. I think there's a lot of resources out there. I know that this is individualized for everybody, but this is definitely something you can do. Like I said, just because somebody's a little forgetful doesn't mean that you need to freak out or think that this is the end or that we need to go to an assisted living right away. But we still need to get the plan in place. And that plan is really just communication with all parties involved. Talking to your loved one, talking to your siblings, talking to your spouse. So remember that if you're a daughter or a son and you're married, your husband or wife has to be able to be part of this conversation too. What do those expectations look like? It's all about communication. If you're communicating, there's always options out there. Anything we know that's coming down the road, we can plan for. And if we have a plan, that's definitely better than not having a plan. I'll open it up for a couple questions that came in, and then we'll go ahead and get done for today.